Today we're finishing up our review of original Innistrad block with Avacyn Restored, the capstone set depicting the Angel Avacyn returning to help her devout followers. Unlike the previous sets, which were focused on how dire the world was for the humans, Avacyn Restored depicted a moment of hope for the humans of the plane. Today, we're seeing if that hope spilled over into the design of the set as well. And finally, before you watch this video, make sure you watch the set reviews of the other two sets in this block for proper context. Now, story-wise, Avacyn Restored was the climax where Avacyn finally turned the tides of battle, returning to protect her people. It's also the set where Griselbrand, one of the most dangerous demons on the plane and possibly the multiverse, was killed by Liliana. This is a reversal of the roles in Dark Ascension, which showed how things go from a state of normalcy to humanity being pushed to the brink. Now, humanity was in a relatively good position. One of the greatest threats to their safety now dead, and their patron angel having returned to protect them. As a result, the set's design had less monstrous mechanics. Both Morbid and Transform from the previous sets were absent from this set, for a few reasons. Morbid had already been around for 2 sets, and the number of monstrous mechanics had to be trimmed down for this set. Transform, however, probably would have still been in the set if it were released in the modern day. It was mostly excluded because at the time, Transform was still a new and somewhat scary mechanic to the player base. While Innistrad and Dark Ascension won the player base over on the mechanic, Wizards was still worried that players would be tired of flipping their cards over after 6 months of limited with Transform cards. So they made the decision to exclude Transform cards to hedge their bets against anyone who didn't enjoy them by not including them in every set of the block. A strange decision to the modern eye, but at the time, Transform was such a drastic departure from what the game was, they decided it was necessary. And that's enough about what wasn't in the set. Let's go to the mechanics that they did try to push in Avacyn Restored. Probably the most famous mechanic from Avacyn Restored was Miracles. Miracle was a mechanic where, if you drew a Miracle card as the first card you drew for a turn, you would be able to cast it for its Miracle cost. This cost was almost always around 1 or 2 mana, a steal for such ridiculously powerful effects. The Miracles had effects like dealing 5 damage to any target, or putting all creatures on the bottom of their owner's libraries. However, the vast majority of the Miracles were kind of uncastable if you didn't draw them at the right time. Thunderous Wrath cost 6 mana to cast normally, far too much for a burn spell, as were other removal options like Banishing Stroke or Vanishment. This already makes the Miracle spells very swingy, but it would only get worse as some of the best Miracles had game determinative effects. You had Terminus and Bonfire the Damned being able to answer your opponent's entire board if you miracled them, or Entreat the Angels, which could swarm a whole bunch of angels for only 4 or 5 mana. The combination of being so game warping and being so high variance can lead these cards to be very frustrating to play both with and against. If you opened any Miracles, they were often just dead cards in your hand. However, you could also be in commanding position over a game only for your opponent to top deck a Terminus and completely reverse the situation. This was sort of the idea behind Miracles. They were cards that would, sometimes, come down in time of your need and miraculously save you from a winning situation. While they did capture that feeling well, the downside of being so dead in your hand made them kind of frustrating to play with. Of course, the biggest issue with the mechanic was a practical one. Tracking what the first card a player drew on their turn was a headache, because that's usually concealed information. Tracking what happens to a card that a player has drawn is, for practical reasons, almost impossible. Once a player has drawn a card and physically put it into their hand with their other cards, you can't really know the difference between any individual card in their hand. This already causes issues with cards like Sylvan Library that interact with cards you've drawn that turn. In order to properly resolve Library and Paper, you have to keep all the cards you've drawn on that turn in a separate pile until after it and any other copies of Library have finished resolving. This is annoying, but since Library is on the battlefield, you're not likely to forget unless you miss it. But with Miracles, you won't have any forewarning about if you're drawing a Miracle until you've already drawn a card. If you drew your card for turn and put it in your hand with the rest of your cards, only to then realize it was a Miracle, you have lost the ability to announce the Miracle trigger. This is to prevent people from trying any sort of sleight of hand tricks to fudge their Miracle triggers, which, knowing how some people act in Magic tournaments, is almost certainly a necessary ruling. However, this often goes against the way that a lot of players play the game in Paper. If you're on any Miracle cards, you have to be very careful about how you draw your first card for every turn to make sure you don't accidentally waste a trigger. All of these small annoyances make Miracle a frustrating mechanic, but not an inherently awful one. It has run into a lot of issues over the years, which we'll go over a bit later, but nothing that would put it into the unsalvageable camp. All of these issues really have mattered if the cards were unplayable. but many of the miracle cards proved to be quite strong. While the single target removal options were usually just worse than their other available options, the mass removal options quickly proved to be quite powerful. Bonfire of the Damned in particular soon showed itself to be just worth playing in a lot of red decks. This is a sorcery for double X and 1 red, which deals X damage to target player or planeswalker and all creatures they control. Or, if you hit a walker, all creatures controlled by the same player. Getting it as a miracle shaves the cost down to just 1 X and a red, which is pretty crazy. If you top decked it on turn 5 and had 4 lands in play, you'd get to deal 3 damage to your opponent and their entire board. Unless your opponent is on a hard control deck that doesn't commit anything to the board, this is almost certain to remove a huge number of creatures on top of burning them for a good amount. This would also translate very well into Modern for a good number of years, where for a while ramp decks like Prime Time would use it to completely blow their opponent out. It would be slowly power crept out of the format, but this is one of the few miracles that was played as intended. The other miracle that saw some play, quote-unquote fairly, was Temporal Mastery. This is a sorcery for 5 and 2 blue that lets you take an extra turn after this one, but then you have to exile Mastery. However, its miracle cost is only 1 and 1 blue. This means it has the same rate as Time Walk, a member of the Power 9. So you can see why, when this card was announced, people kind of lost their minds about it. However, it quickly proved to be a lot worse than people imagined. Sure, getting to take an extra turn for just 2 mana was great, but extra turn spells are at their best when you're using them purposefully. Often, Temporal Mastery just cycled for another card and let you add an extra land. And being an upgrade explorer is fine, but it's really bad when the card is just rotting in your hand. Rather than being something that literally every blue deck just slammed in, it was only used for very specific decks. Probably its most famous home is the very funny modern deck Walks. This is a deck that just plays as many extra turn spells as possible, alongside ways of slowing the game down, like Giga Drouse and Howling Mind effects to draw extra cards every turn. Once you hit 5 mana and cast your first Time Warp, you'd attempt to chain as many extra turn spells together as possible. Eventually, you end up with enough mana to resolve a card like Jace the Mind Sculptor to eventually win the game. This deck wasn't great, but it was a good home for Temporal Mastery. Of course, by far the most infamous of the miracle cards were Terminus and Entreat the Angels, both known for being used in a legacy deck called Blue-White Miracles. This was a deck built around the surprisingly powerful artifact Sensei's Dividing Top. This artifact costs 1 mana and lets you pay 1 mana to look at the top 3 cards of your deck, then put them back in any order. You can also tap it to draw a card and put top back on top of your library. I shouldn't have to say how good this was with miracles. It allows you to check the top of your library whenever you want, deciding the perfect time to cast your miracle spell. The ability to draw a card with it makes it even better, because miracles don't care if it's the first card you drew on your turn, just the first card you drew on any turn. So if you top deck Terminus or Eternal on your opponent's turn, miracle will still trigger, and the game will let you cast them right then and there despite them being sorceries. This means you not only get to consistently wipe the board for 1 mana or make a board full of angels for cheap, you can do this at instant speed. Miracle decks were made even more oppressive by cards like Counterbalance and Brainstorm that were incredibly good in this top deck based strategy. Due to, well, a lot of reasons, Sensei's Divining Top would eventually be axed by both Modern and Legacy ban lists, essentially killing Miracles as a deck. Despite no longer being playable, Miracle was the best deck in one of the most powerful formats in the game for years. People still play Terminus here and there thanks to Brainstorm still being very strong with the card, though it's not close to the glory days of Top and Counterbalance completely locking your opponent out of the game. The other new mechanic that was introduced and restored was Soulbond. This is a somewhat complex ability. If the card isn't paired yet, you can pair it with a creature whenever either one of them enters the field. So when you play a soulbounded creature, you could pair it with anything in play. But if it wasn't paired, anytime another creature enters the field, you could pair it with them. However, they can only ever be paired with one other creature. Then, every card with Soulbound would have another ability that affects the 2 creatures that are paired together. Usually, they would both gain an ability, like Tandem Lookout, letting both of them draw you a card whenever they hit an opponent. Soulbound was one of those mechanics that comes and goes through Standard without much fanfare. There was a fair share of good Soulbound cards, but none of them were good enough for older formats, and there was nothing about it that changed the way the game played fundamentally or did anything weird with the rules. It was a very unique mechanic, but it didn't end up having a ton of staying power. The thing about Soulbound is that it's a very feast or famine mechanic, and could be a bit inconsistent. Sure, when you played out your Wolfar Silverheart, you were adding a ton of stats to the board, but as soon as they killed one of those cards, you were losing out on a lot, at least until you drew another creature to play. In a way, they're sort of like creatures that are equipment. They need other cards to reach their full potential, but if those other cards get removed, you at least didn't lose everything. Overall, Soulbound creatures were probably more playable than the average equipment thanks to being creatures up front, but the lack of powerful support cards and the lack of any new Soulbound creatures being printed resulted in them being a bit of a flash in the pan. As a fairly mediocre standard mechanic, it's mostly remembered for having a bunch of cards that are pretty good. Lightning Mauler and Nearheath Pilgrim are both 2/1s for 1 and 1 red, or 1 and 1 white respectively. Mauler gives the bonded creature haste, and Nearheath Pilgrim gives lifelink. These were somewhat common to see in low to the ground aggro decks, but they weren't amazing. More common to see were Silverblade Paladin and Wolfar Silverheart. Paladin is a 2/2 for 1 and 2 white that gives the paired creature double strike, allowing to deal both first strike damage and normal combat damage. Double strike is one of the most powerful keywords in the game, as doubling the damage a creature does can make your opponent go from being safe to being almost dead out of nowhere. This made Paladin a very strong option for both low to the ground aggro decks and more mid-range white decks. Wolfar Silverheart was a 4/4 Wolf Warrior for 3 and 2 green that gives both paired creatures +4/+4. This, once again, mostly saw play in aggro decks. Usually cards this expensive would be looked at with suspicion from aggro decks without an ability like haste, but buffing a creature as soon as it comes into play was pretty close to having haste. Of course, Silverheart was outclassed by other aggro threats like Thundermaw Hellkite, as were most of the other Soulbound cards. The most successful overall was Silverblade Paladin, as its combination of low mana cost and incredibly powerful ability made it a lot less risky to play than the other Soulbound cards. Of course, by far the most famous Soulbound card is Deadeye Navigator. This is a 5/5 spirit with a mana cost of 4 and 2 blue. It gives both paired creatures the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 blue to exile that creature, then return to the battlefield under your control. Being 6 mana instantly excluded this from most formats, but Navigator found itself a home in Commander. Thanks to the higher life totals, paying 6 mana for a card is a lot more practical. Once you have it on the battlefield, you'll be able to pay 2 mana at any time to blink either creature, giving you a ton of extra on battlefield triggers, as well as letting you dodge removal. You can even flicker the Navigator itself to repair it with any of your creatures at any time, making it incredibly versatile. Navigator is considered something of a staple in Commander, which is probably the most any Soulbound creature has done so far, even if it isn't a competitive format. The last keyword in this set is Undying, returning from the last set, Dark Ascension, to continue being surprisingly good for how simple of an effect it is. While the keyword produced a lot of very powerful cards in Dark Ascension, it didn't do as much this time around. There were only 6 cards of the keyword this time around, as opposed to the 14 cards of the mechanic in Dark Ascension where it debuted. This was probably done to show how weak the monsters were now that Avacyn had come back, but that didn't change how disappointing it was coming from its strong showing last set. The best card with the mechanic this time around was Butcher Ghoul, a 1/1 zombie with Undying for 1 and 1 black. This was essentially just a worse young wolf, which had the same stats and ability for just 1 mana. But Undying is strong enough that the card found at least some success. It was used in basically the same way, just in non-green decks. Now that we know what mechanics are running around, we can talk about the limited format. Avacyn Restored, atypically for the final set of a block, was meant to be drafted alone. It was also a larger set with 244 cards to supplement being drafted alone. Similar to our original Innistrad, there weren't as well-defined draft archetypes. No signpost uncommons to filter players into particular archetypes, and only a few very obvious archetypes to draft. Often you're looking for more generic draft archetypes, like using white and red combined good early game threats to make a powerful aggro deck. There were a few common threads in Avacyn Restored draft. White and blue both had a number of cards that flicker your creatures. Combining this with low rarity creatures like Voice of Providence and Gryff Vanguard could allow you to amass a ton of value. It also lets you reset your Soulbound creatures, giving them extra utility in this limited format. Black had a focus on sacrificing its own creatures yet again. Red had a bit of a Humans Matter theme, with Vigilante Justice being a build-around that paid you off for playing them. Humans appeared in basically every color, though they were probably most common in white. Green was all in on Soulbound, with cards like You Spirit and Flowering Lumbernaught that really wanted something to bond with them. To supplement this, they had some counter cards and protection spells to keep their creatures around. The payoff was being able to draw extra cards off of Triumph of Ferocity. Humans were the only tribe to get anything approaching support in the set, and all of it was in red. Werewolves were completely absent from the set, as without transform cards, their gimmick just didn't work. In the end, similar to the original Innistrad, Avacyn Restored was very freeform with how you built your decks. However, a few issues ended up cropping up. First off, the set really didn't have many good build-arounds to make interesting decks with. There was no spider spawning or burning vengeance. Very few decks could muster together any type of powerful synergy, and the ones that could were very inconsistent or weak. The Humans tribe has to make use of a lot of individually cards like Thatcher Revolt, which if you didn't have your enablers around was almost entirely useless. At least it was better than Flowering Lumberknot, which literally did nothing if you didn't have your Soulbound cards around. Another thing they tried to push in this set was a loner archetype, a few individually strong threats in blue and black which would punish you for having other creatures around. As a payoff, you could use cards like Homicidal Seclusion to make them more powerful. This was incredibly inconsistent though, as it meant you would be completely blown out by a single removal spell. Incredibly inconsistent describes a lot of the cards in the set actually. When we went over Soulbound and Miracle, we mentioned how they were often high variance mechanics. That was mostly referring to Constructed, where you get to choose what cards to play and could run consistency boosting cards. These mechanics, however, were a nightmare in Limited, where a Bonfire of the Damned off the top was unbeatable as opposed to Constructed, where it was just backbreaking. This wouldn't have been so bad if it weren't for the set being extremely weak overall, meaning that these swingy, inconsistent bombs were very hard to beat with the lower rarity cards in the set. The aggro decks were slow, and the synergy between the cards were weak, meaning that a lot of the decks had a really hard time beating powerful bombs like Malignus. If your opponent actually drafts a Sigarda Host of Herons, you usually just lost. Sure, this was a mythic rare, so it wasn't that destructive to the draft experience. What's worth mentioning here is just how low power the commons and uncommons were in comparison to the higher rarity cards. Most limited formats are one off the backs of commons and uncommons, despite them being weaker, because they form the backbone of most decks. The gap in Restored is so massive, and the vast majority of limited archetypes so non-functional, that the high rarity bombs take up a lot more space in the draft's meta. The combination of weak and inconsistent archetypes, a generally low powered set, and good high rarity cards earned Avacyn Restored a sour reputation, especially in comparison to Innistrad Limited, which, to repeat, is one of the most beloved limited formats of its era of Magic. So, Limited was kind of a bust. But how did this set do in Constructed? To get a bit of a glimpse of the constructed power of the set, we'll go over all the mythic rares in the set, and take a look at how strong they were. The first of which is the poster child of the set herself, Avacyn the Angel of Hope. This is a legendary 8/8 angel with a mana cost of 5 and 3 white. She has Flying and Vigilance and the abilities where both it and all other permanents you control have Indestructible, which does what it sounds like. Anything with Indestructible can't be destroyed by damage or any effects. Avacyn is simultaneously a card that has never once been playable in any competitive format, and never been worth less than $15. While not a particularly strong card, Avacyn is still iconic, and, to put it simply, cool. It was instantly popular with casual players, which of course translated to it seeing a lot of play in Commander. Essentially, despite being incredibly weak in competitive settings, Avacyn was still a very desirable card in the Mythic slot. The other white mythic was Entreat the Angels, and how it was incredibly powerful in Legacy, so we don't need to return to it here. Similarly, the miracles Temporal Mastery and Bonfire of the Damned have already been mentioned. All the mythic miracles besides Mastery were extremely good. And while Temporal Mastery was a disappointment, it wasn't a complete dud. In addition to Mastery, Blue got 2 other mythics. The first is Misthollow Griffin. This is a 3/3 Griffin with flying for 2 and 2 blue. It also has the very unique ability where you can cast it from exile. This card is a bit too slow to be played fairly, but luckily it had Food Chain to completely break it. Food Chain allows you to exile a creature you control to add X mana of any one color, where X is its mana value plus 1. This can let you cast Misthollow from exile over and over again, gaining 1 mana each time. Players instantly recognize this, and Misthollow has been a key part of Legacy Food Chain ever since. Despite having a place to see play, Misthollow has never really been worth much of anything. So for a monetary perspective, it was still a dud despite being a powerful card. The next is Tamiyo the Moonsage. This is a 4 loyalty planeswalker with a mana cost of 3 and 2 blue. It has +1 where you tap target permanent, and it does an untap during its controller's next untap step. You can -2 it to draw a card for each tapped creature target player controls, and you can -8 to get an emblem with the abilities where you have no maximum hand size, and whenever a card is put into your graveyard, you can return it to your hand. This is a very strong planeswalker. Not only can it lock down a creature basically forever, it can also mess with other types of permanents if your opponent doesn't have any creatures left. Like most walkers, it was essentially a clock that forced your opponent to act. The emblem it made it impossible for your opponent to ever win, thanks to being able to recast your removal over and over. The draw mode was also very good, though it was difficult to draw too many cards off of it without Tamiyo dying next turn. Still, if she wasn't long for the world anyway, you might as well go ahead and draw off of her. It's probably not much of a surprise to hear that Tamiyo saw a ton of play in control decks in her standard, though she hasn't really done anything since rotating. Black received 2 Mythics. The first is Descend into Madness. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 and 2 black. It is the ability where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a Despair counter on it. Then each player exiles a card from their hand or permanent they control for each Despair counter on Descent. This is very similar to old staples like Smokestack, which slowly eat away at everyone's board. However, Descent just wasn't all that strong. Exiling was a lot more painful than sacrificing, and it eating up your hand made it difficult to play around. While this did hurt your opponent, it also made it hard for you to actually do anything yourself. It also couldn't be cheated out with broken cards like Mistra's Workshop, so your opponent had a lot of time to develop their board before you got your lock piece in play. Descent isn't and never has been good due to just being too slow at its job. The other black mythic was Grizzlebrand. This is a 7/7 legendary demon with a mana cost of 5 and 3 black. It has flying and lifelink and the ability where you can pay 7 life to draw 7 cards. Grizzlebrand is an extremely powerful card, because the line of text next to draw 7 is so good that if you get Grizzlebrand into play for even a single turn, you usually just win. The card has seen play in a ton of combo decks throughout the years, from Grizzlebrand to Reanimator to Goro's Vengeance combos. Grizzlebrand was the demonic counterpart to Avacyn Angel of Hope, though he was much more successful than she was. Interestingly, there's a bit of a controversy amongst casual players involving these cards. To sell how Grizzlebrand was a mirror of Avacyn, he was given the exact same mana cost as Avacyn, just with black mana. However, unlike Avacyn, whose stat line was 8/8, Grizzlebrand was 7/7, and had the number 7 come up even more with his ability to pay 7 life to draw 7 cards. So a lot of people were upset that his mana value wasn't 7 as well. Of course, this would mess up the entire mirror image of Avacyn thing, so there really wasn't a perfect answer here. On to red. Its mythics were a bit lackluster. Malignus is an elemental spirit with a mana cost of 3 and 2 red. It has the abilities where its power and toughness are each equal to half the highest life total among all of your opponents rounded up, and any damage dealt by it can't be prevented. Unfortunately, this card wasn't all that good. While it could be pretty big, just having huge stats isn't enough to make a card good. Even on this front, Malignus was rarely actually all that useful. Once you get your opponent close to death, around 8 or so life, Malignus will only be a 4/4 or so, making it worse than basically any other creature at this mana value. Other bundles of stats like Lord of Extinction can be made much larger and keep their stats for the same mana value. The other upside, making its damage unpreventable, is only there to get around a niche ability, so it's not really all that relevant. The other red mythic was Tibalt the Fiend Blooded. This is a 2 loyalty planeswalker with a mana cost of 2 red. You can +1 him to draw a card, then discard a card at random. You can -4 him to deal 4 damage to target player equal to the number of cards in their hand. Finally, you can -6 him to gain control of all creatures until end of turn. You untap them and give them haste until end of turn. Tibalt is a pretty famous card, mostly for being absolutely terrible. The +1 ability was actively harmful as often as it was helpful, and there weren't that many ways to make it better. Even graveyard-focused decks need more control over what they're discarding, and it was just outpaced by cards like Faithless Looting from the same block. The burn damage was insignificant thanks to requiring so much loyalty to use, and the ultimate was basically impossible to get to. Tibalt was a community meme for years because of how awful the card was. Though, considering how powerful Rent and 6, the only other 2 mana planeswalker in the game, ended up being super broken, it's probably good the card was bad. Mini asterisks. Green also only received 2 mythics. The first is Craterhoof Behemoth. This is a 5/5 beast with a mana cost of 5 and 3 green. It has haste and the ability where, whenever it enters the battlefield, it gives all your creatures +X/+X and trample until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. Essentially, if you have even a few creatures out when you cast Hoof, it's game over. This quality has made Caterhoof a staple top end for weird, creature-based combo decks in multiple formats. Most builds of elves will be playing the card, and it's the most common combo finisher for green decks and Commander as well. Basically, if a format has an easy way to cheat out big creatures, or ways to make lots of mana, people are hoofing for game. The other green mythic was Primal Surge. This is a sorcery for 8 and 2 green. It has the effect where you exile top card of your library. Then you may put that card into the battlefield if it's a permanent. If you do, you repeat this process. This is a potentially powerful card that's just not practical enough. In order to cast Surge, both quickly and consistently, you're going to need to play lots of non-creature spells like Farseek to get yourself extra mana. However, if you play even a few other non-creature spells in your deck, the risk of only cheating out a couple of cards and then whiffing with Surge gets too great. Even in Commander, with its massive card pool and slower game speeds, Surge is far too inconsistent for most players to stomach using the card. The final mythics are Avacyn's 3 Angel Sisters: Bruna, Light of Alabaster, Gisela, Blade of the Gold Knight, and Sigarda, Host of Herons. Bruna is a 5/5 legendary angel for 3, 2 white and 1 blue. It has Flying and Vigilance and the ability where, whenever it attacks or blocks, you can attach any number of auras on the field to it, and cheat out any number of auras in your graveyard or hand to attach to it. This is, probably not surprising, a weak card, as resolving entirely around auras is a recipe for disaster. Auras are already a very weak card type, and Bruna's ability to cheat them out for 6 mana is just too clunky. Maybe if it could cheat out ones from your deck as well, people may have had some success slapping on an Eldrazi conscription onto it, but needing to have both cards in your hand for the combo was just too clunky to work. Gisela was a 5/5 legendary angel for 4/1 red and 2 white. It has Flying and First Strike and the abilities where it doubles all damage to your opponents and permanents they control, but halves all damage that would be dealt to you or your permanents you control. Gisela fared better, as it didn't require other cards to do anything. This made it far more attractive for Reanimator decks in Standard, enabled by Unburial Rites from a previous set in the block. However, it was still outdone by Angel of Serenity in Standard thanks to its incredible powerful Enter the Battlefield trigger, making it good even if your opponent just killed it right away. Gisela is still pretty popular in Commander, but it wasn't the best mythic to pull back in the day. Finally, the last sister is Sigarda, Host of Herons. This is a 5/5 angel with Flying and Hexproof for 2, 1 green and 2 white. On top of having Hexproof, it also had the ability where your opponent's spells and abilities can't make you sacrifice creatures. This means that board wipes were the only way to out Sigarda, a type of card that only very specific decks played. This made Sigarda an amazing threat against a wide variety of decks, namely the decks that literally had no way to kill it once it resolved. Sigarda was the only sister good enough to not only see consistent play in Standard, but it also broke into formats like Modern. It has also been power crept out of the format, but at the time, it was a great card to have. Having looked at every mythic in the set, Avacyn Restored maybe has the best mythics in the block. The number of misses are surprisingly low, with only about 6 of the cards being misses, and the others all seeing competitive play or being valuable cards. It did end up getting power crept, so now the cards aren't worth as much. But at the time, Avacyn Restored's mythics were basically all worth something. Griselbrand was probably the biggest standout, and it never quite hit the same heights as cards like Liliana of the Veil. But considering how few bad mythics there were, it might still have the best all-around high-rarity lineup. The rares in this set, unfortunately, didn't quite stand up to the power of the mythics. The low-rarity cards only added a couple of important cards to the pool. Ghostly Flicker is one of the few ways to flicker multiple cards at once for a small amount of mana, and is pauper legal. It's strong enough in the format to be a build-around for several decks. Blood Artist was the first 2-mana creature that drained 1 life from your opponent when a creature died, and was extremely powerful. We brought this up when going over some of the other pieces in the last few set reviews, namely Falkenrath Aristocrat, but it was one of the cards that enabled the very first Aristocrat deck. The 2 most notable rares for Constructed that haven't been covered somewhere else in the video are Restoration Angel and Zealous Conscripts. Conscripts was a 3/3 with haste for 4 and 1 red. It is the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you still target permanent until end of turn. You untap the creature and give it haste for the turn. This was a good top end for aggro decks, as getting a 3/3 with haste on top of Threaten was a good way to end a game. But it also is one of the many ways to go infinite with Kiki-Jiki Mirrorbreaker. This is yet another simple combo. Kiki-Jiki can be tapped to create a copy of a non-legendary creature with haste, but you have to exile that token at the end of turn. By copying Conscripts, you can use their Enters abilities to untap Kiki-Jiki, letting you loop this to create a whole swarm of 3/3s to attack your opponent with. This gave Conscripts a niche and birthing pod combo decks before the cards banned in Modern, on top of being powerful in Standard. Restoration Angel, funnily enough, can actually also be used as part of this combo. Resto was a 3/4 with Flash and Flying with a mana cost of 3 and 1 white, with the ability where, when it enters, you get to flicker a non-angel creature you control. This ability wasn't just good for going infinite, it was also just great with any creature with another enter or leaves the battlefield effect. For example, Thragtusk in the same standard would give you 5 life and make you a 3/3 if you flickered it with Resto, a massive swing in your favor. This set also finished the cycle of utility lands in the block with Alchemist Refuge, Desolate Lighthouse, and Slayer Stronghold. Refuge lets you pay 1 blue and 1 green to tap it and lets you cast spells as though they had flash until the end of turn. Lighthouse lets you pay 1 blue and 1 red to draw a card, then discard a card. And finally, Stronghold lets you pay 1 red and 1 white to give target creature +2/+0, haste, and vigilance until end of turn. All of these cards saw at least some competitive play. Refuge is the weakest of the 3, with its ability being fairly niche. Most games, you'll never really want to give your cards flash, or at least you won't pay 3 extra mana to give them the ability. Lighthouse has seen a lot of play in blue-red decks to give them a better long game. Simply being able to turn bad draws into better ones by looting them away instantly proved to be extremely powerful. The main reason it doesn't see much play nowadays is because it's generally just worse than Castle Vantress in terms of fixing your draws. Slayer's Stronghold, once again, saw play with our old friend Primetime. If you had an Amulet of Vigor, you could tutor out a Stronghold and a Boris Garrison, and you can give your Primeval Titan haste to attack right away, grabbing 2 more lands and pushing your advantage even more. People do still do this, but there are so many other combo lines for the decks nowadays that it's not as common as it used to be. Finally, the last land from the set to break into other formats, and the most broken, was Cavern of Souls. This is a land that makes you choose a creature type as it enters the battlefield. You can tap it for colorless, or tap it for 1 mana of any color. If you do, that mana can only be spent on creatures of the chosen type, and that spell can't be countered. This is one of the most broken pieces of tribal support the game has ever seen. Not only is it great mana fixing, it also makes the card uncounterable just for the heck of it. This became an insta-staple in literally every tribal-focused deck, and see some play non-tribal decks just because making your threats uncounterable can be that good in certain matchups. Cavern still fetches quite the high price despite several reprints, which really goes to show how in demand the card is. The set also had a surprising number of cards that would be called commander staples in the set as well. Exquisite Blood was an enchantment with a mana cost of 4 and 1 black, with the ability where, whenever an opponent loses life, you gain that much life. On its own, this isn't that interesting of a card. However, there are multiple cards such as Veto, Thorn of Duskrose that make your opponent lose life whenever you gain life. This once again is an infinite combo. And Exquisite Blood is the only card in the game that can do this. Considering how Commander allows you to always have access to a specific creature card, this can make Exquisite Blood a much more powerful card than it usually is. There's also Conjurer's Closet, a 5-mana artifact that flickers a creature you control at the beginning of your end step. Flickering is a very popular effect in Commander, and this is one of the only ways that, for example, mono red or mono green decks can get access to the effect. So it's no surprise that a lot of players have taken to using the card in Commander. While the set isn't exactly devoid of strong cards, it is notably lacking when compared to the Innistrad proper. There were fewer cards worth pulling outside of the Mythic slot, and it had the fewest good low rarity cards of any of the sets. A lot of the good cards from the set were also mainly played in Commander, which had only recently been endorsed by Wizards and wasn't the titan of casual play that it is today. Overall, this puts Avacyn Restored in a spot of being okay, but not as exciting as previous sets. So that was Avacyn Restored. And with that, we've reviewed all original Innistrad block. Avacyn Restored was a bit of a weak conclusion to what was overall a beloved block. Still, it wasn't a complete train wreck. It still introduced a lot of very powerful cards to the game, probably more than the average set did. It simply pales in comparison to how strong the block started with Innistrad. While Avacyn Restored may have stumbled on the landing here and there, it still has so many iconic and beloved cards that it's hard to call it a bad set. As a whole, the block was on the stronger side, both in standard and in terms of cards that would see play in non-rotating formats. The theming was obviously a hit with the players, considering we returned to the plane on 2 separate occasions already. The block introduced the transform mechanic, which at this point may be one of the most iconic Magic mechanics from the modern age. From mechanics to theme to power level, basically everything in Innistrad was a success, even if it wasn't without its faults.